we need to defossilize our energy system. And out of the, I think it is 47 projects within the European Union, 22 are lithium projects. Outside of the European Union, 13 projects were selected, one of which is a lithium-related project, and that is Jada in Serbia. Royalties, taxes should be something that is a benefit from mining. Yeah? The state allows a company to mine in its area. If a mine pollutes the area, if a mine pollutes a river, etc., those benefits should not be used to clean up. I think that's actually the responsibility of the company that actually causes the pollution, etc. We will see further reduction in environmental impacts related to water impact. We'll get better with recycling of water, soil impacts.
Poštovani gledaoci i slušaoci Demostata, dobar dan. U najnovijoj epizodi podcasta Pola sata Demostata razgovarali smo sa profesorom Mihaelom Tostom, šefom katedre za inženjerstvo u rudarstvu i ekonomiju mineralnih resursa na Univerzitetu Montan u Leobenu u Austriji. O čemu smo razgovarali sa profesorom Tostom, koje smo to aktuelne teme sa njim prošli i gde će se sve na teritoriji Evropske unije u narednom periodu otvoriti rudnici litijuma. O svemu tome poslušajte i pogledajte u najnovijoj epizodi Pola sata Demostata.
So, Professor Tost, to what extent is the transition to new technologies, renewable energy sources, and energy storage expected to reduce greenhouse effect and slow down increasingly evident climate change?
Well, let me start on that last part, climate change. I guess what is important there is we need to defossilize our energy system. That means basically we need to get away from oil, gas, and coal towards basically renewables and an electrification of our energy system. And in order to get there, we need a lot of minerals. We're basically replacing the fossil fuels with other minerals that enable that transformation. And part of those or some of those minerals, that includes, for instance, lithium, that includes copper, that includes aluminium, nickel, cobalt, and some other metals. And I guess we're going to talk about lithium a little bit in more detail later on anyways. But in that context, the European Union has also acknowledged that needs to happen. And therefore, in the Green Deal, on the one hand, where they made that commitment to make that transition from fossil fuels to renewables by 2050, and at that time be basically the first carbon neutral continent in the world. So we need to see this in this context, that we will need more metals, minerals, and we need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels.
After decades of stagnation, mining in Europe is once again gaining momentum, even more than before. How does the European public view these plans, especially when they take place in their immediate surroundings?
I guess there is, I would say there is no European view. There is, however, those views in the surroundings, and those can be very different in a sense. And I'll give you some example. I live in Austria, and I live close to one mining region where mining has been done for more than 1,000 years. That's an iron ore mine, and it's been dominating life there. Yeah? So people not just accept that mine, but they actually, the whole culture in that area, in that region, is around mining. And there is another bit further away, but nevertheless, an example in Austria where the whole region, but the federal state is actually has been dominated by that one mineral, that's salt in this case, and Salzburg might ring a bell to you as well. That is based on salt. The whole culture, the whole economy was actually developed on that. And indeed, if you go back very much so in history, there's an historic time named after Hallstatt, which is one of the centers of that salt mining. So if you were to ask those areas, those regions about acceptance of mining, they'd be very positive. So there is historic examples that it can be done in a proper, in a beneficial kind of way as well. If you were to compare that then with some new regions nowadays where mining is just about to come to town, I guess that certainly is different depending then on the approach in those areas, in those regions. Portugal, Spain, again going back into lithium are some examples where there is resistance. And obviously in Jade there is resistance or has been resistance as well around that project. And to some extent, and that also goes back into history, based on negative examples from history, mining related, that you also have in Serbia, to my knowledge as well. Yeah. So we actually, I guess, have to change that. We have to have approaches towards mining that more go in the direction of acceptance and that positive examples from history that I mentioned, and definitely cannot go in that negative direction, those negative examples. And I think key and core to that is also that you have to have decent and proper engagement processes in place. And one example for that, with our university is just now involved with a project in Norway, rare earth elements project, and they certainly are engaging with local stakeholders, that local immediate surroundings, as you called them before, on a very positive basis, and they certainly have positive relations established with that surrounding.
It's very good to hear that. But to what extent are new environmentally friendly mining and processing technologies currently being used worldwide? And how much is planned for future implementation?
If I remember correctly, in our last conversation, I mentioned the SUMEX project, Sustainable Management of Extractive Industries, which has been a European Union project that our university coordinated. And as part of that project, we came up with a roadmap on what sustainable mining could and should look like in Europe. Roadmap to 2050. I mentioned the Green Deal before, so mining in line with the Green Deal in Europe has to be carbon neutral by 2050 as well, just to give you one example. Yeah? And as part of that project, we actually looked at good practice examples and created a database of those good practice examples of this new environmentally friendly mining, responsible mining, as you could call it. And one example of those technologies that we put into that database as a good practice example, for instance, is dry stacking of tailings. Something that, again, coming back to the Jade project, is already in the plans of that project as well. Yeah, so I would say that those environmentally friendly practices that we collected as part of that EU project, over the next years, we see more and more of those projects to be considered as sort of the new baseline for new projects going forward, such as with the Jade project and tailings management there.
Is it possible for the EU to secure a greater share of critical raw materials from its own and neighboring sources? And does the goal of meeting 10% of total demand seem unambitious?
I don't think answer that question first. I don't think it's unambitious because that is 10% in 5 years. Yeah, so that you're referring to the 10% goal in the Critical Raw Materials Act. And that is, as I said, in 5 years. So to some extent, we're starting from zero. So zero to those 10% in 5 years, where bringing new mining projects online usually takes, that's what we teach our students, somewhere in the range 10 to 15 years. I think that is highly ambitious. The other story, can we do that for all of the critical raw materials that the European Union has defined in the Critical Raw Materials Act? And that's more than 30 now. I don't think so. So for some of those, we don't even know whether or not we have the deposits in the European Union or in Europe, sort of more broadly. Yeah. For some of them, we will be able to fulfill those goals, those targets, and I think we will also exceed those goals, those targets, and the 10%. And one where I'm optimistic that that's going to be the case is, for instance, lithium. The European Union has defined under the Critical Raw Materials Act, and in order to achieve those 10%, what they call strategic projects. And out of the, I think it is 47 projects within the European Union, 22 are lithium projects. So I do think that we will be able to achieve the 10% goal in some of the minerals, not all of them, but I also think, yes, 10% is not unambitious, but it is ambitious.
But can revenues from mining royalties collected by the state be used to remediate the environmental consequences of ore extraction and processing?
I would say they shouldn't, in a sense that royalties, taxes should be something that is a benefit from mining. Yeah? The state allows a company to mine in its area, and for that, the state gets benefits via royalties. That's the right to mine, basically, and they get taxes if that company makes a profit. Profit taxes, they get taxes from the employees, etc. So I don't think that's one thing. That's benefits from the mine. If a mine pollutes the area, if a mine pollutes a river, etc., those benefits should not be used to clean up. I think that's actually the responsibility of the company that actually causes the pollution, etc. However, we talked about responsible, environmentally friendly mining before. So the way you should set up a project these days, and the way projects are actually planned now in Europe, is that it doesn't come to that stage, that there is no pollution. So you plan your project in line with national legislation, with national laws, and they should indeed prevent that pollution to happen. You plan it, if the European Union is involved, along the rules and regulations of the European Union, Water Framework Directive as one example, and that should prevent all of that to actually happen.
Speaking of royalties, what is the approximate level of mining royalties in European Union countries?
Very different. So there is no approximate level that you can say this is sort of well, there probably is an average that you could calculate, but it is very different. Let me start with one extreme, that would be Austria. The royalty rate in Austria, if you were to mine metals in our country, is 0, because metals are considered, and that goes back after World War II and the re-establishment of the economy. But in order to incentivize companies to look for, explore basically metals, and then to mine those metals and infuse them into the economy, government wanted to incentivize this. So they put the rule in place, 0 royalties. to incentivize companies to go out. And it's basically the rule is finders keepers. So if you find metals via exploration, you get the permit, and then you don't pay royalties. That's one extreme. The other extreme is, of course, higher royalty rates, and then it depends on how those royalties are collected. So there is differences there as well on a per ton produced basis, on a dollar of revenue basis, etc. So different schemes. Yeah. And if you were to look, considering those different schemes, you have royalty rates 2%, 3%, up to 5%. And 5%, I think, is the royalty rate that is of relevance for the Jada project in Serbia. Your metals, I think, I did some research in that, are between 3 and 7%. And 5% is to be applied to be used for Jada, if I'm not mistaken, on a revenue base in those different schemes that I mentioned before. So in the European context, I would say you are already at the higher end. I forgot Sweden or Finland, 0.6%, so very low to the lower end, as I mentioned with Austria as well. If you were to compare that to outside of the European Union, and particularly with regards to lithium, Australia at the moment is the largest lithium producer in the world, particularly also based on hard rock, as will be the case with the other project as well. And they are also at the rate of 5%, but for spodumene concentrate. So if you were to compare that to the same rate as you use it in Serbia, it would be lower than your rate. So I do think from that economic benefits, again, point of view, that the general public and the state benefits from allowing a company to mine on its land or within the national borders. I do think you're actually on the rather higher end of the spectrum with regards to metals. Of course, oil and gas, that's a totally different story, because there the rates are 30% or one quarter, 25%. Yeah, but different story.
Very interesting figures. But Professor Tost, in what ways will the EU actually support projects that enable the extraction, processing, or storage of renewable energy, including exactly those projects outside of the EU, such as the Jada projects in Serbia? Will this support focus on investment plans, administrative assistance to the state, or do you think it will be focused on cooperation with the local population?
I think a little bit of all of what you just mentioned is going to be the case. So that support from the European Union, I already mentioned the Critical Raw Materials Act before. So that's sort of the legal basis. I mentioned sort of the critical raw materials, and within that they have another new category that they call the strategic raw materials. Those are exactly the ones that are relevant for that energy transition that we already talked about earlier on. And within those, for instance, you have lithium as well. Yeah. So what the European Union did already was that projects with regards to sort of those strategic minerals, such as lithium, they could apply with the support of their national governments. That is important to become strategic projects within the European Union. And that the first round of those applications happened last year, and earlier this year in, I think, March for projects within the European Union. And then don't quote me exactly on that. I think in May they published also for projects outside of the European Union. So in countries where they have partnerships in place, so raw materials partnerships in place, companies, projects could also apply. And out of that first round, I already mentioned before, 47 projects within the European Union were chosen, out of which 22 are lithium-related projects. Outside of the European Union, 13 projects were selected, one of which is a lithium-related project, and that is Jada in Serbia. So in total, out of the 60 projects, 23 are lithium-related projects. So a large majority is actually lithium-related because it plays that crucial a role in that energy transition. So what can those projects now expect is indeed better access to financing. So the European Union will help those projects to finance the realization of those projects. That's not necessarily subsidies, but that could actually be access to credits, access to loans that they otherwise would not get that easily or that quickly. That also means working with them or having rules in place with regards to the permitting process. So there should be a speeding up of the permitting happening for those strategic projects. In fact, the Critical Raw Materials Act says that the permitting process needs to happen within 2 years. And again, that brings us back to those 10% in 5 years. With those rules in place for those minerals that have now been accepted, it should actually be possible to ramp up those projects in that period of time. There is also, for those projects, then an obligation to meet European regulation, legislation, but also certain guidelines that they've put in place, including also guidelines for sustainability. And as part of those guidelines, you mentioned before community engagement, etc. Those things also play a role. So there is an expectation. It might not be support, but certainly there is an expectation from the European Union that those strategic projects actually live up to those expectations as well.
How likely is it then that mining, especially with the use of new technologies, can avoid emissions of harmful gases and contamination of not just water, but also soil?
Mm-hmm. I actually think that the answer to that is highly likely. I would actually go as far as to say that even with today's technologies, let's not talk about we touch base on the new technologies already, but standard is that you don't hear about mining. It's just the accidents, the incidents, and well, the bad apples, so to say, that you hear about. But the large majority of mining operations in Europe, from local aggregate quarries all the way to metal mines. I mentioned Erzberg mine, the iron ore mine here in Austria. People don't hear about them because they already meet the current legislation, the regulation, all the requirements that they are supposed to meet. So I would argue that that is already standard. And then add to that the new technologies where we get even better, then I would say the answer to your question is highly likely. So we will see further reduction in environmental impacts related to water impact. We'll get better with recycling of water, soil impacts. I would foresee more underground mining in Europe with those new developments, which needs less space at the surface and therefore has lower impact on soil, etc. I already mentioned before tailings disposal, waste management, waste from mining, where the tailings used to be stored in so-called wet tailings disposal systems, where you built dams and then you pumped the tailings into those facilities within those dams as a slurry, which there has been accidents related to this technology in the past. granted, but now we're moving away from that technology towards dry stacking of tailings, as is planned for the Jada project as well.
The other
dry
project
land is safer. So I do think, long-winded answer, or the short answer to your question now, yes, highly likely.
The other project in Serbia, on the other hand, has sparked widespread protests with concerns that it will lead to severe pollution of air, water, and land. How justified, from your perspective, are these concerns?
Let me maybe start with a comment, very short one, and I won't go into any details on that, but I also do think that those protests were part or are part of the broader political situation in Serbia as well. And I certainly, as a foreigner coming from Austria, cannot and won't comment on that. Yeah. What I can say, however, is specifically for the Jada project, and I've reviewed and I've seen the plans, the draft environmental impact assessments, etc. Those plans are good in the context of what I said before, European Union rules with regards to rules and expectations with regards to sustainability. They are at the forefront of technology, dry stacking of tailings, recycling of water, closed systems for the chemicals that are going to be used. Sulfuric acid, I think we discussed in way more detail already in our last conversation as well. So I think those plans are good. And what I can see, however, is that many of the conversations, at least that I've been aware of, or the kind of the pressure points in the protests in those conversations were not based on the actual plans. Yeah, were not based on actual facts. Radioactivity. I don't see radioactive materials anywhere in the ground there. So if you were to mine there, you cannot have radioactive materials polluting your water. The closed systems and emissions from those closed of sulfuric acid. Even some of those processing parameters that I saw on social media have been wrong. Yeah, the plan says a certain temperature. In the media, read about other temperatures, much higher temperatures, much higher pressures. I've seen photos of open pit mines, large open pit mines, as part of sort of what is being criticized. To my knowledge, that has never been the plan for the Jada project. It has always been planned to extract via an underground mine with lower impact on the surface.
Exactly.
So, sorry, just to finish off. So there is all those plans. My take is there is the facts related to those plans that I think are good. And the last comment is also then hold the company accountable to those plans. Yeah? Establish monitoring, measuring systems, and you can do a lot with regards to that as well. And I think they are also parts of the plans. But ask the company in the engagement processes for the type of data that you would like to see with regards to air emissions, status of air quality, with regards to water quality, etc. Ask for that and hold the company also accountable for publishing that type of data and having those monitoring systems in place.
Exactly. And it has been emphasized that the process of extracting lithium and boron from ore will result in solid rather than the liquid waste, which can be stored safely. So just briefly, how important is this?
So I think I mentioned that already before when I spoke about sort of tailings, and that current technology used to be that wet tailings disposal, those dams, and then you pumped the slurries into those facilities. now in the plans of the other project, they actually moved towards dry stacking of the tailings. So rather than pumping a slurry into those basins, they try the reminders of the processing, the tailings, and then store them in dry conditions. There is two advantages to that. One is a safety advantage. It's safer to do it this way from a stability point of view of that storage facility. And the second is also that it requires much less land. Yeah. Think about sort of 1/3 of your tailings is the fine sand, the reminders of the processing, and 2/3 is water. Now you try that, 2/3 of your mass are basically gone, meaning that only 1/3 is left, and therefore you require much less space to store that 1/3 of the original mass as well.
But I must ask, is there a risk of water, soil, or air pollution beyond the boundaries of the project site?
I think there always is that risk. This is kind of a question the same way if you get on a plane, you don't expect that plane to crash. And it doesn't happen very often, luckily for us, but nevertheless, it still happens. Yeah, every once in a while, you read about that in a newspaper. So I guess that's the same with an industrial facility. You plan your processes as good as you actually can, yeah, for them to be as safe as they actually can be at the moment. You plan them to be as environmentally friendly as can be. But I do think there always is a reminder of a risk as well, and you need to handle and deal with that as well. So on the one hand, you plan risk prevention into your plans, not for sulfuric acid we mentioned already, to actually somewhere there is a leak in your closed system, then it gets out of that closed system. But you start with planning a closed system. If it gets out of that planned system, you need to capture whatever gets out. So you have a second line of defense. You might have a third line of defense. You build your plant away from a zone that is prone to flooding, etc., so that the water is actually kept away and far away, so that it cannot get into the water either. So you have lines of defense here as well, yeah, protective barriers, etc. So if the worst case happens, kind of think of if you are on the plane starts crashing and you have a parachute on you, you can still get out of that one as well, as sort of the last line of defense. So you are kind of prepared for that worst case as well. You try to prevent it, but you're prepared for it as well.
But what types of accidents could potentially occur in a mine processing plant of this type? And what would be the consequences? In what ways does the project mitigate the risks of such accidents?
Let's start generically. Everything can happen in a mine, from very small things like a paper cut. Yeah, you have people working in the office, they cut their fingers on papers. To the worst case, I already mentioned tailings and wet tailings disposal. There have been accidents in the past where those tailings dams collapsed, and then that materials, the wet tailings, they were actually able sort of to escape those facilities, and they basically were avalanches that moved out of those areas into the open, killing people, polluting the area. Yeah, I mentioned underground mines. The worst case could actually be that underground mine to collapse, or parts of the mine to collapse. We actually saw that just, I think, last week in Chile, where a part of large underground mine actually collapsed, and miners got trapped there. And unfortunately, I think 3 or 4 miners got killed there as well. So worst case can really be catastrophic. And again, going back to what I said before, you try to prevent those worst cases. On the first hand, or on one hand, by design. So we're getting ever better in understanding underground mining, for instance, the rock mass. Or we change the processes, dry stacking instead of wet tailings disposal, so that we prevent the risks, we minimize those risks. But on the other hand, I think we're also getting better in terms of monitoring the conditions underground, the conditions of a dam, etc. And we know if something changes, that something is happening there, and you might actually be able to evacuate the mine, for instance, before something happens, so that at least then the consequences are less severe as well. So better planning, better monitoring, better dealing with the aftermath as well.
The very last two questions. How is the other project addressing the need to balance environmental responsibility with economic opportunity based on your vast experience?
I actually don't think that you can balance the two. So in a sense that what you're implying with that question is there is going to be a negative environmental consequence. Therefore, we have to create a positive economic consequence, benefits, and those should be in balance. I actually think you have to have both. So your environmental impacts need to be minimized. And then, if that is the case, you actually have to create the economic benefits as well. So you have to find ways to do both. It is not one needs to be balanced with the other. You cannot destroy the environment for jobs or for taxes and royalties. You actually have to do both, protect the environment as well as generate economic benefits. And we talked about responsible, modern, sustainable mining before. If you do it, if you plan your operations accordingly, then you can actually do that. That you actually do both environmental responsibility as well as generation of economic opportunities. And that, I think, needs to be done in the short term as well as in the long term. And that, for me, also includes, speaking of sustainability, beyond the actual mine as well, so that you then create, both from an environmental perspective as well as from an economic perspective, a positive legacy post-mining and beyond the mine as well.
And also, based on your experience and understanding, where does the continuous stream of disinformation surrounding this project originate from? And do companies in European countries face similar challenges when proposing their projects?
Again, let me start this with sort of the broader political situation in Serbia that I think plays a role. And again, I don't want to comment on this, but in that context, a couple of months ago, a paper has been published in a scientific journal called Mineral Economics. And that paper is called Lithium at the Crossroads. And those scientists publishing that paper actually looked at the Yada project specifically and the protests and where they were coming from. So they actually looked at various aspects in sort of the broader political comments. They commented on that as well, sort of Serbia between Russia, China, the West playing a role. Then they looked at social media and the role of social media and how that played a role. They looked at some of the key media companies in Serbia as well and how they could play a role. So I guess rather than me sort of talking about that, I guess those scientists in that paper actually explained sort of the situation. What I already mentioned, however, is sort of from a scientific I have an engineering background. So from that background, I mentioned already that some of what has been presented in the protests, I don't think is what is actually in the plans of Rio Tinto for the other projects. Yeah, open pit mine versus underground mine, wet tailings disposal versus dry stacking of the tailings, impact on water. There is plenty of things that I would not see as sort of the scientific reality, so to speak. Yeah, and that, I guess, causes concerns and confusions, and adds to why we see what we actually see on the ground. Is that unique in Europe? No, it is not. But certainly, and I said that very much at the beginning, there is no European view, but there is many local views. Yeah, and I mentioned also that there is concerns, for instance, in Spain and in Portugal. There, I give you one example. There is a mine, again, another lithium mine planned there, but it's an open pit mine, as the plan is at the moment, in a highly touristic and agricultural area. Some similarities with regards to agriculture, probably to Yada. But an open pit mine in such an area might not be the best thing to do. Yeah. So there is different circumstances at each of those locations. With regards to sort of the political situation, there is also, I mentioned already one project in a Nordic country that we are involved with. And in one of the project meetings there, that I found that very interesting. But in one of those meetings, management was actually informed by police, state police, that they are seeing signs of interference against the project on social media, originating from outside of the European Union. So whilst I can't comment on the other project this way, certainly we are involved and have seen involvement from players outside of the European Union influencing and impacting social media postings concerning certain projects. So make no mistake, that exists, yeah, as well.
It's a very broad topic, definitely. Thank you once again for explaining all these very important issues for all of us, for our viewers and our listeners of half an hour of Demostat. It was very valuable, and we thank you once again for taking your time.
Thank you for having me, Tamara.